On a bright and sunny Sunday in March, Chris, a 39-year-old project manager at a large construction company in Phoenix, Arizona, woke up feeling an overwhelming sense of excitement. Today was no ordinary day. It was his daughter Mia's 7th birthday. The day he had been looking forward to for months. Together with his wife Lisa, a freelance graphic designer, they had planned a simple surprise party for Mia, themed around her favorite princess. The house was already buzzing with the preparations. A colorful display of balloons floated in the living room, and a beautiful birthday cake sat proudly on the kitchen counter, decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Chris stood back, admiring the work they had done, and a sense of gratitude washed over him. He felt fortunate to have such a happy family, a loving wife, and a bright, joyful daughter. They had worked hard to build a comfortable life together, and moments like these made him appreciate everything he had. But as he stretched and glanced toward Lisa, who was already up and moving around the kitchen, Chris noticed something different. Lisa wasn't her usual self this morning. As she prepared breakfast, her attention seemed to be entirely absorbed by her phone. Her fingers were quick, swiping across the screen, and every few moments, she would pause, staring at the screen with a tense look on her face. It wasn't like her to be so distracted, especially on such an important day. He brushed off the thought and moved on, believing that maybe she was just caught up in the excitement of the party. After all, she was the one who had designed all the invitations, the decorations, and even the game plan for the afternoon. He knew how much effort she had put into making Mia's day perfect, so maybe the stress of making everything just right had her a little on edge. Despite this, something about Lisa's behavior unsettled him. Even when they sat down for breakfast together, her eyes never left her phone. The sound of clinking silverware and soft conversation filled the room, but Lisa seemed disconnected, distracted, and almost anxious. Chris tried to focus on Mia, who was excitedly talking about all the presents she hoped to receive, but in the back of his mind, the nagging feeling that something was wrong kept growing. Lisa, for her part, seemed to sense his growing discomfort. She put her phone down occasionally, but only to speak briefly to Mia or help with the decorations. Every time she did, Chris saw her glance at the phone again, and he noticed the way she seemed to check it secretly, as though trying not to draw attention to it. He didn't want to be suspicious. After all, she was his wife, the woman he had been married to for over a decade. He trusted her completely. So, he chose not to dwell on it. When guests began arriving for the party, Chris put his concerns aside. The house was filled with laughter and the sound of children's voices, and Mia was surrounded by her friends and family, all eager to celebrate her big day. The atmosphere was cheerful, and for a moment, Chris allowed himself to enjoy the party fully. But even with all the noise and joy around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, he would catch Lisa slipping out of the room, disappearing for a few minutes to make a phone call or answer a message. When she returned, she would act as though nothing had happened, but Chris noticed how her smile seemed a little forced, and how she would avoid meeting his eyes. Chris continued to keep his thoughts to himself, trying not to let his worries spoil Mia's celebration. He knew how much his daughter loved these moments, and he didn't want to ruin the day for her. But deep down, the unease gnawed at him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The party went on, and Chris did his best to stay engaged with the guests, talking and laughing along with everyone else. But as the afternoon wore on, the mystery surrounding Lisa's behavior only deepened. He couldn't stop wondering what was really going on with her. Then, as the clock struck 2 p.m., a delivery arrived at the door. A large bouquet of deep red roses, elegantly wrapped and tied with a ribbon, was handed over to Lisa by the delivery man. The flowers were lavish, their vibrant color standing out against the bright Arizona sun. Chris watched as Lisa took the bouquet from the man, her face immediately paling as she clutched them close to her chest. She tried to smile and thank the delivery man, but her hands were shaking slightly. Her face was flushed, and Chris noticed the tightness in her jaw. The moment felt odd, almost like the entire room had frozen for a second. "Who are they from?" Mia piped up, her excitement rising as she saw the large bouquet. "Mom, why are they so big? Are they from someone special?" Lisa froze, the smile on her face faltering just slightly before she forced it back into place. She quickly tried to deflect Mia's question with a vague answer about how it was just a mistake or some sort of mix-up. But Chris saw it. He could see the way Lisa's fingers trembled as she carefully placed the flowers on the table. As Lisa hurried off to get a vase, Chris stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. The card attached to the flowers was still visible. It was elegantly written in a flowing script, the message clear and unmistakable. For the most precious woman in my life. Every moment with you is the greatest gift. D. Chris stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in his mind. D. Who was this mysterious person? Why had they sent such an expensive, extravagant bouquet to Lisa, of all people, on Mia's birthday? The room suddenly felt much smaller, and the air thick with an uncertainty Chris couldn't explain. His heart raced, his mind spinning. What was going on? Why was Lisa acting this way? With a growing sense of dread, Chris tried to keep his composure. But one question kept repeating in his mind: who was Dee? Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the party continued around him, he tried to push the thought of the mysterious bouquet from his mind, but the question of who Dee was kept haunting him. Lisa had been acting strange all day, but the arrival of the flowers was the tipping point. Something wasn't adding up. He glanced over at Lisa, who was now in the kitchen, carefully arranging the flowers in a vase. Her movements were stiff, almost too deliberate, and Chris could tell she was trying to hide her unease. She was avoiding his gaze, her back to him as she fussed with the stems, her hands shaking slightly as she cut the stems to fit the vase. Chris felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Mia was still running around with her friends, oblivious to the tension in the air. The room was filled with the sound of children's laughter, but Chris couldn't join in. He was too distracted by what he had just seen. He knew he needed answers, but he didn't know how to get them. Lisa's evasiveness, her nervous energy, it all pointed to something that wasn't right. He had to find out who Dee was and why his wife was hiding it from him. As the afternoon wore on, Chris's unease grew. Every time Lisa left the room, he could feel his heart rate quicken. She was becoming more and more elusive, sneaking off to check her phone or whispering on the other end of the line when no one was around. Chris tried to remain calm, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Finally, after a few hours of pretending everything was fine, the last of the guests had left, and Mia was in bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day. The house was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Chris sat in the living room, staring at the door leading to the bathroom where Lisa had gone to freshen up. This was his chance. When Lisa stepped into the bathroom, Chris knew he had to act fast. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but his curiosity and worry had become too much to ignore. He stood up, his legs heavy, and walked to the kitchen. Lisa's phone was sitting on the counter, forgotten in the rush of the day. It was unlocked, the screen facing up, a few unread messages visible. Chris hesitated for a moment. Was it wrong to look? To invade her privacy like this? But then he remembered the flowers. The card. The strange, cold distance that had come between them over the past few months. He needed to know the truth. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he tapped on the messaging app. There, at the top of the conversation list, was a name he hadn't seen before: Daniel. His heart sank. Chris clicked on the conversation. The messages were frequent, some of them recent, others dating back months. As he scrolled through them, his mind reeled. The messages were not professional, far from it. They were intimate, flirtatious even, filled with affectionate words, heart emojis, and late-night conversations. Chris's hands began to tremble as he read more, unable to pull himself away from the screen. The messages dated back over 6 months. Lisa had been having an affair with Daniel, a colleague from her design company. Chris felt his breath catch in his throat. He had suspected something for a while, but seeing it in black and white, reading the words himself, was a different experience altogether. His heart felt like it was breaking, shattered into a million pieces. How could Lisa do this to him? To their family? He had always trusted her completely. They had built their lives together, raised their daughter together. This betrayal, it felt like a punch to the gut. But what hurt the most was that Lisa had kept this secret from him, hidden it from his eyes for so long. Suddenly, the sound of the bathroom door opening pulled Chris out of his thoughts. His heart raced as he quickly set the phone back down on the counter and pretended to be busy. Lisa entered the room, her face slightly flushed, but she didn't seem to notice his tension. She smiled weakly and asked, "Are you okay? You look off." Chris swallowed hard. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't pretend. "I need to ask you something, Lisa," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Lisa paused, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's wrong? Who's Daniel?" Chris asked, his voice cold, his eyes locking onto hers. And why were you texting him like that? Lisa's face drained of color. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone on the counter. But it was too late. Chris had already seen everything. The truth was out now. Lisa stood there in stunned silence for a few moments. Her lips trembled, and her eyes filled with panic. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. She began, but Chris cut her off. Don't, he said, his voice low but firm. I've seen the messages. I know everything. Her face twisted with guilt, and for the first time that day, she didn't look away from him. But it was too late for apologies, too late for excuses. I'm sorry, Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Chris shook his head, the hurt in his chest growing deeper. You don't get to apologize now. Not after everything. You've been lying to me for months, Lisa. The words felt like they had been ripped out of him. He didn't want to be angry, didn't want to hate her. But the pain, the betrayal, it was too much. The trust they had once shared was shattered, and Chris knew he could never go back to the way things were. I don't know what to say, Lisa replied, her voice breaking as she tried to hold back tears. I never meant for it to get this far. It was a mistake, Chris. It was a mistake. Chris stared at her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind was racing, torn between the love he once felt for her and the overwhelming anger and heartbreak that consumed him now. This wasn't just about an affair, it was about everything they had built together, everything they had promised each other. It was all a lie. I can't do this anymore, he finally said, his voice strained. I can't keep living in this lie. The air in the room was thick with tension. Chris could feel the weight of the decision settling heavily on his chest. His mind was a whirlwind, but one thought kept repeating over and over, I can't do this anymore. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she tried to find the right words to explain herself. But no words could undo the hurt she had caused. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship had been shattered in a matter of seconds, and the more Lisa apologized, the more Chris's anger and pain grew. I never wanted to hurt you, Chris. I didn't want this to happen, Lisa whispered, her voice cracking. She took a hesitant step toward him, but Chris took a step back. I don't want to hear it, Lisa, Chris said, his voice colder than he had ever heard it before. You had months to tell me the truth. Instead, you lied. You hid this from me. From Mia. I trusted you, and you destroyed that trust. Lisa looked down at her hands, her tears falling freely now. I didn't know how to stop Chris. I never meant for it to go this far. Daniel. He was someone who made me feel wanted. Chris interrupted her. I don't need to hear your excuses. This isn't about him. This is about you. You chose to betray me. You chose to keep secrets. And I can't forgive that. Not after everything. Lisa's face crumpled in pain, but Chris wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as though he had already checked out of their marriage emotionally, even if his body was still standing there. I've been feeling this distance for months, Chris continued, his voice growing softer, almost to himself. I kept telling myself it was just stress or work, or maybe I was imagining things. But I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to admit it, and I kept pushing those thoughts away, hoping they weren't true. But now I know. I was right. Lisa collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. Chris, please. I'm so sorry. I love you. I love Mia. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake, I swear. Please, don't end it like this. Chris closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The words that had been building up for days, for months, were now spilling out of him, raw and unfiltered. I can't live in this lie anymore, Lisa. I can't pretend like everything is okay when I know it isn't. I need the truth. And I need space. For a moment, the silence between them was suffocating. Lisa's sobs filled the room, but Chris couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Not after everything. He had given her his heart, his trust, and she had betrayed it. I want a divorce, Chris finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. Lisa's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face pale as she looked at him in disbelief. What? No, Chris, please don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't leave me. But Chris was done. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was too much to ignore. He had tried to make their marriage work for years, and now, he felt like everything had crumbled around him. "I'm sorry, Lisa. But I can't stay in a marriage built on lies. I need to move on. For my own sanity. And for Mia." Lisa's face crumpled in sorrow, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll fight for us, Chris. I'll fight for Mia. Please don't leave." Chris looked at her for a long moment, but there was no turning back now. He had made his decision, and as much as it hurt, he knew it was the right one. As he turned to leave the room, he heard Lisa's voice call out, "Please, Chris." But he didn't stop. He couldn't. That night, after the house had quieted and Mia had gone to bed, Chris sat alone in the living room. The silence was deafening. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, but the weight of his decision felt overwhelming. He had just torn apart the life he had known, and even though he knew it was the right choice, it didn't make it hurt any less. His mind kept drifting back to Mia, their 7-year-old daughter, who had no idea what was happening. How could he explain this to her? How could he tell her that her mother's betrayal had destroyed their family? The thought of hurting Mia was the hardest part of this whole situation. She didn't deserve any of this. But Chris knew there was no other option. He had to protect her from the toxic environment their marriage had become. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about doing what was best for Mia. The next morning, Chris made his decision clear. He filed for divorce and began the long, painful process of fighting for full custody of Mia. Lisa, devastated by the loss of her marriage and her family, pleaded with him to reconsider, to give their relationship another chance. But Chris was resolute. He couldn't go back. Not now. Lisa's attempts to salvage their marriage were met with resistance, and while she promised to do better and begged for forgiveness, Chris knew that the damage was irreparable. Her actions had left scars too deep to heal. After the divorce was finalized, Chris threw himself into raising Mia. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt overwhelmed and uncertain about the future, but he found strength in his daughter's smile, in her laughter, in her unconditional love. Lisa, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of her life. Her career, once thriving in the world of design, had taken a hit. The scandal of her affair had tainted her reputation, and rebuilding her life was harder than she had ever imagined. But Chris wasn't concerned with Lisa anymore. He was focused on Mia, on their future together. The pain of the past was still there, lurking in the background, but Chris knew one thing for certain: he was doing what was best for Mia. And that was all that mattered. The days after the divorce were a blur for Chris. He moved through the motions of daily life, taking care of Mia, going to work, and handling all the responsibilities of raising his daughter alone. Every day felt like a mix of exhaustion and numbness, but through it all, Mia was his anchor. Her smiles, her giggles, and her infectious enthusiasm for life reminded him why he had made the decision to end his marriage to Lisa. She deserved better than a home filled with deceit and tension. There were moments when Chris would catch himself thinking about what might have been. What if things had been different? What if Lisa hadn't betrayed his trust? But those thoughts never lingered long. The betrayal was still fresh, and no matter how much he loved her at one point, he knew there was no going back. Not after everything that had happened. Chris found himself spending more time with Mia, doing the things that made her happy. Weekends were filled with trips to the zoo, movie nights with popcorn, and lazy afternoons at the park. Chris was determined to be the best father he could be, and he knew that Mia needed him more than ever. One day, as they were walking through the park, Mia looked up at him with her bright, innocent eyes and asked, "Daddy, will you ever get married again?" Chris's heart caught in his throat. He hadn't thought about dating or remarriage since the divorce. He had only focused on Mia and getting through each day. But now, hearing her ask the question, he realized how important it was for him to be honest with her. She had been through so much already, and she deserved to know how he felt. "I don't know, sweetheart," Chris said gently, his voice filled with thoughtfulness. "Right now, my focus is on you. I just want to make sure you're happy, and that you have everything you need. We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Mia nodded solemnly, her small hand holding tightly to his. "I just want you to be happy too, Daddy." Chris smiled down at her, his heart swelling with love for the little girl who had been the light in his life through the darkest moments. "I'm happy as long as I'm with you, Mia. You're all I need right now." Mia smiled brightly, and for a moment, Chris felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, happiness was still within his reach. Over the next few months, Chris's life slowly began to find a new rhythm. He adjusted to being a single parent, navigating the challenges that came with it. There were times when he missed the companionship of a partner, but he wasn't ready to jump back into a relationship. The scars of his marriage to Lisa were still too fresh, and he needed time to heal. Lisa, on the other hand, was struggling. Her life had been turned upside down, and the reality of her actions hit her harder than she expected. Her career, once flourishing, had been severely impacted by the scandal surrounding her affair. Clients were hesitant to hire her, and many of her colleagues distanced themselves from her. She had lost not only her family, but also the trust and respect of the people around her. She tried to rebuild her life, but it wasn't easy. There were days when Lisa felt completely alone, when the weight of her mistakes seemed too much to bear. She called Chris several times, apologizing again and again, but he had made it clear that their relationship was over. He wasn't interested in rekindling anything. All he wanted was peace, for himself and for Mia. One evening, as Chris tucked Mia into bed, she asked him a question that made him stop in his tracks. "Do you think Mommy will ever come back home?" Mia's voice was soft, filled with the innocence that only a child could have. Chris's heart ached, but he knew he had to answer truthfully. "Sweetheart, Mommy isn't coming back. But that doesn't mean we won't be okay. We're going to be just fine, you and me." Mia looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty, and then she smiled. "I'm glad I have you, Daddy." Chris kissed her forehead, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm glad I have you too, Mia. I'll always be here for you. Always." Over the next several months, Chris continued to put his energy into raising Mia. He learned to balance his work life with his role as a father, and while there were difficult days, he found a strength he hadn't known he had. He was learning to live for himself again, slowly but surely. Then one afternoon, he received an unexpected message from a woman he had met briefly at a work event before the divorce. Her name was Sarah. She was kind, warm, and had a sense of humor that made Chris laugh in ways he hadn't in years. They had exchanged numbers, but Chris never thought anything would come of it. He wasn't ready for a relationship, and he certainly wasn't interested in dating. But Sarah had sent him a message asking how he and Mia were doing. She had heard about the divorce and wanted to check in. Chris was taken aback by the gesture. It was a simple message, nothing extraordinary, but it made him realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as closed off as he had thought. It had been a long time since someone had expressed concern for him, someone who wasn't tied to the heartbreak of his past. He thought about it for a while, weighing the possibility of opening his heart again. It was a daunting thought. Could he really trust someone again? Could he take the risk of loving someone and getting hurt all over again? But as he sat with Mia that evening, watching her laugh at a silly movie, he realized that life had to move forward. It was time to let go of the past and begin to embrace the future, one step at a time. He didn't need to rush into anything, but perhaps it was time to open his heart to the idea of new beginnings. Chris took a deep breath and decided to reply to Sarah's message. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope for the future. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the pain he had experienced. Maybe there was still room for love and happiness. Slowly but surely, he was learning to believe that. And as he watched Mia drift off to sleep that night, a small hopeful thought crept into his mind. The future is waiting, and I'm ready for it.